Hello again, whiskey friends. Thanks for joining me today for another episode, everybody. And hey, if this is your first time here, why don't you stick around, see if you learned something on this particular topic. This is a follow up to a video that came out a few weeks ago where I talked about essentially half the whiskeys on the shelf, all being from the same distillery. And I was kind of being a little dramatic about it. But what I was surprised about, and sometimes I forget, I suppose, we are all in different parts of our whiskey journey. And I started getting some messages on Instagram and private messages just kind of saying like, "What? Those all those brands you highlighted come from the same distillery? How? They're all different products. Like what are you talking about?" So it appeared to me that some people still aren't in the know in regards to sourced whiskey and some of the most popular labels on the shelves that are coming out of Indiana, is ultimately where they're distilled from. So I wanted to break down this topic a little bit, address some of the questions that I received in those messages, and then take it from there. So thank you for joining today, whiskey friends. Let's kick off the show. All right. And during today's episode, I will theoretically be drinking some Backbone bourbon. Here, get that to zoom in there. But Backbone is one of my favorite brands that has stuff coming out of Indiana. This was a good pick. This one I haven't gone back to in a little bit, but this was a 10-year pick, originally distilled in 2008 and released in 2019. So, for those that do know what MGP is, hey, stick around. When we get to the back of the video, maybe I'll have some more content that you'll be interested in, but we are going to go through kind of the history of MGP and ultimately highlight a whole lot of the brands that actually are sourced from Indiana, theoretically MGP. So, taking a step back before we get into it, when my whiskey journey began in 2017, I just kind of jump in the deep end when I get into something. So, I went to the liquor store, party service over here in Northern Kentucky, bought a bottle. A couple days later, bought a bottle. A couple days later, bought a bottle. Started doing reviews on Distiller of those bottles. And the more I kept exploring these, I was just like, man, I like this one. I like this one. I like this one. And I have a friend who was into bourbon before I was. So he was kind of my bourbon guru at the time. And I would just keep texting him about the brand I was really, really excited about. And he would text me back, "Yeah, Jeff, that's MGP. Yeah, Jeff, that one too. That is MGP as well." And just over and over again. I mean, it seemed like every third or fourth bottle I was highlighting ended up being MGP. And for the most part, MGP became my daily drinker for quite a bit there, particularly the Boone County 1833. If you were getting those back in 2017 to 2019, that was just my daily drinker. It cost $50 and it was delicious. It was a 12-year, 90 proof product. It was perfect for where I was in my journey. But man, I would just have these stories with my friend. And, he would just give me all these weird stories too when I was first getting into whiskey, meeting random men in parking lots, at all hours of the night to, you know, do stuff with bourbon. Very, very strange stories. Fast forward a few years, I then find myself meeting random strangers in parking lots for the purpose of bourbon. So not too strange in retrospect, but still strange to say out loud. But yeah, ultimately I was bringing home all this MGP and eventually I just figured out like, hey, you know what? This is actually my favorite distillery. I like everything coming out of Indiana versus Buffalo Trace, Heaven Hill, all the legacy distilleries. Love them too, don't get me wrong, but I tend to gravitate towards MGP. If you're looking at the shelf behind me, this is essentially an MGP shelf. You're also going to notice a whole lot of blank spots in that shelf, and that's because I'm going to highlight some brands in just a moment, and I pulled all these bottles down next to me, and we are going to be kind of dramatic about going through some of the brands that are MGP today. But let's go take a step back. What is MGP? That is one of the questions that I got. It stands for multi-grain product. This is a company that was formed in 1941 and was the leading supplier of alcohol during World War II. After World War II, they transitioned to spirits. Ultimately, they didn't get into whiskey until around, it was 2011, and they bought the Seagram plant that is in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. So a lot of the old bottles that I do reference when it's between the era of 2005, 2008, I mean, we call it MGP because I guess they technically bought those barrels at the time, but it was actually distilled by Seagrams. And even some of those old labels, you'll see the name LDI before that. So it's gone through a whole bunch of name changes. It's been traded around a little bit like a baseball card when it comes to the distillery in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. But that is where MGP now rests with their whiskey production. So all the ryes and all the bourbons, majority of the time when you see distilled in Indiana, it's coming from Lawrenceburg. It'll a lot of times say distilled in Lawrenceburg. You know exactly where that's coming from. They did recently go through a rebranding, and now the distillery is called Ross and Squibb. For the most part, everyone still calls them MGP, which gets into some of the branding that MGP does and has struggled with over the years. But we'll handle that in just a moment when we go into the brands. But ultimately, that's what we are getting into. When you look at the back of a label and you see distilled in Indiana, that's most likely coming out of Lawrenceburg. Now, we can say that today. We could say that the last 10 years. We'll be able to say that in the future. I don't know. There's a lot of good things coming out of Indiana these days. Hard Truth would be one in particular. If Hard Truth starts sourcing ryes, hey, distilled in Indiana won't mean the same thing that it used to. So for now, at the recording of this video, majority of the time that you see distilled in Indiana, it is coming out of MGP, but there are a lot of Indiana distilleries that are popping up lately. So this was the question that I was getting then. It was like, what brands are sourced by MGP? Can you explain this concept to me? Have I been drinking MGP all along? What about this brand? What about this brand? And a lot of times the answer was yes as we were going through it. I ended up just sending people links to there's a whole page that's just got like all the brands that have been sourced by MGP. It was a little out of date because some of these brands have since transitioned to their own juice or stopped doing MGP sourcing and maybe transitioned to other distilleries for their sourcing. But let's go over some brands today that you will see on the shelf that are actually Indiana. So this is the part where I'm going to pull all these bottles off of the left-hand side here. Now, getting into one of their own brands, and we're going to come back to this, but we got the George Remus. So this is an MGP brand. I already highlighted them, but Backbone Bourbon, getting their stuff from Indiana. Now, on all these, be careful and always check that it's distilled in Indiana when I say that, because sometimes these brands do source from different companies. Copper and Craft. So Copper Craft, we got Barrel King. That's a popular one, but they're using Indiana. We then have brands like Hirsch. Some of these single barrels are from Indiana, so you got to check the back. Traverse City. Some of these ones distilled in Indiana. Here's one that might surprise people. When it comes to these Redwood Empires, these haystack needles, a lot of times it's Indiana. Another popular one, Buzzard's Roost, coming out of Indiana. Old Scout, coming out of Indiana. Nashville Barrel Company, a lot of the barrels coming out of Indiana. I'm going to keep going, by the way. Tumbling Dice. Barrel Bourbon. Got to check the back of this one in particular because they get stuff from everywhere. Jepson's. Four Gates. Some of these, not all of them. This one's particularly the Indiana Foundation 10-year. Boone County. A lot of their stuff coming out of Indiana, though they're in the process of maybe transitioning to their own stuff, it sounds like. Bull Run, getting Indiana light whiskey. Nulu, another one. Got Down Home, the real popular one, Smoke Wagon, still in Indiana. All right, here's a rye. Old Carter Rye, blend of Indiana Rise. And then, though discontinued or distillery only now, but the Bell Mead brand that used to be on the shelves everywhere. Indiana. I mean, that's just a slew of brands that I just pulled off the shelf behind me here just to highlight it. And there are a whole bunch of brands that I don't have in the house that were distilled in Indiana. So that's why I say so much of what you see on the shelf is potentially all from the exact same distillery. The next question I got was, hey, if it's all from the exact same distillery, does it taste the same? The answer to that is actually no. So that's the surprising answer to that. What is essentially happening, and I kind of find this to be a funny experiment, but some of these barrels are all over the country, aging in all different types of climate, and they also have different cooperages that they're working with. And that affects the taste as well. So depending on the cooperage and depending on the climate and the location, you can get different flavors. The other thing that is going on and has been going on the last couple of years, but I'd say a vast majority of the finished products that are on the shelf are also distilled in Indiana as the source. So for me, that's been fun because if one company's doing a cognac finish and another company's doing a sherry finish and another company's doing Mizunara casks, you can just try MGP and just see what it tastes like in all of these different casks. Whereas with the legacy brands like Heaven Hill, they might be doing one-off finishes here or there, but they're not coming out with a whole bunch of them across the course of the year. So to kind of see how it tastes like this, how it tastes like that makes a huge difference. The other thing that makes the biggest difference with MGP, I think, is the age. So recently, within the last 5 years, they kind of ran out of aged stock and they kind of reset everything. So you went from being able to buy 12-year single barrels, 13-year single barrels, blends of 12-year stocks, to all of a sudden only being able to get 4-year stuff. And this is as recently as 2020. Now, the stocks have built back up. This year, I've been able to get my hands on consistently 9-year and 10-year single barrels. And hey, hopefully next year it turns into 11 years, and year after that, steady stream of 12 years again. But that's another big thing that does impact the taste. And because of the different cooperages, because of the different climates, and then them releasing them at some companies are releasing it at 2 years old. I mean, they're releasing it at every age possible. You kind of get then to get to taste things through and see what it tastes like at all the different phases, which once again, you can't really do with some of the other legacy distilleries that are controlling their own product and the quality of their own product. So the other thing to kind of keep in mind too is that what they are doing is buying brands. So traditionally, MGP has struggled to get their own brands off the ground. So what they've been doing is acquiring brands. One of their probably most successful brands that you might think is homegrown is this Remus brand. So Remus is a brand that MGP does own, but the George Remus brand they didn't create. Other guys created it. And then in a very circular world, not only did some other guys create it, they then bought OKI from New Riff. And now the same guys that created George Remus now have the OKI brand. And then they're getting their whiskey back from MGP again. So it's one big cycle going through these brands. I'm sure they're hoping to sell OKI to MGP at some point. Who knows? The one that just got recently bought in a big sell was Penelope. So Penelope was getting their stuff from MGP, and then they sold the brand. So that will be a MGP owned brand going forward. And then the big acquisition that took place in 2021 was with Luxco. So when it comes to brands like Rebel, that is now in the MGP portfolio, but just to confuse things further, Luxco makes their own distillate too. So now MGP has distillate coming out of Indiana and coming out of Kentucky. So who knows? It's going to get all confusing here. But that highlights some of the circle that's been going around. The other question I got is, well, why would people source from MGP? And for the most part, it's just to get product out the door and get the ball rolling on things, not to wait 4 years, 5 years for your product to be ready to sell. You want to sell stuff now, you source from MGP, and then you have a transition plan later. So New Riff is a great example of that. Prior to being New Riff, they were OKI, like I was saying earlier. and they source these MGP barrels. Then they transitioned, notice it's the exact same bottle shape, to New Riff. And then they stopped selling MGP, and then they sold that OKI brand. Other brands that made that transition, I noted Boone County. Boone County is now making their own pot still. So they've been an MGP brand for years. Hey, maybe not anymore if they lean all the way into their pot still. So eventually those brands try to have some type of succession plan. Another example would be High West, the Midwinter Night Dram. If you go back to Acts 1, I believe, through 4, that was an MGP rye. And then they transitioned to their own starting in Act 5, if I've got my timeline right. So that's the main reason that a lot of these brands are using the Indiana distillery. It's to get their foot in the door, either while their own product is aging, or they just don't have the means to create their own product, but they want to get in the whiskey game. The last thing that I'll end on here is when it comes to MGP, any given year, there have been companies that have the hot hand. So all of these companies are selling MGP whiskey, but man, some of them are higher quality than others. Some of them taste better than others. Might have to do with the climate they were aged in, as I was noting before. But if you think about some of the companies that had the hot hand, 2 years ago, I'd say that was Smoke Wagon. Smoke Wagon had the hot hand, and I was buying a whole lot of Smoke Wagon. Now what am I buying? Well, I'm buying the Nashville Barrel Company. They've got a hot hand right now. They got a lot of good barrels. Backbone Bourbon has been coming out with some really good 7-year, 8-year single barrels. The other ones I really like are the light whiskeys coming out of Indiana, and that is your Bull Runs, that's your Obtainiums. I didn't even pull Obtainium off the shelf. There's another one that sources from Indiana. Barrel King has a whole lot of hype right now. So ultimately, that is what I try to do. As being somebody that really likes this Indiana whiskey, I just try to stay ahead of it, be in the know, listen to people, listen to who's releasing older barrels, and just try to stay ahead of it as far as acquiring these single barrels at any given time, and just keep track of who has that hot hand, because it has been exchanging over time, especially as stocks wear out and they have to go back to a broker or go back to MGP and get new barrels. That next batch might not taste the same as their good batch that first time. You just don't know. So that is ultimately answering the question of what is MGP? What does distilled in Indiana mean? So hopefully this helped fill that gap a little bit for those that were a bit puzzled by the video I released a few weeks ago. And also keep in mind, this story really only fits right now. So while a vast majority of the time you see distilled in Indiana, it's coming out of Lawrenceburg. Once again, lots of Indiana distilleries. Hard truth, if they start sourcing, man, we got a rye competition now for distilled in Indiana ryes. So that concludes everything that I wanted to cover today. Let me know if that cleared things up, if you were confused before. Let me know if there's any other questions stemming off of this video. I'm always up for talking about some MGP. I'm always up for drinking it too. Well, thank you for joining me today, whiskey friends. I'll catch you on the next Tuesday discussion. Goodbye, everybody.
Jeff, just be friends with me. But you have these whiskey friends, and you say hello again. Oh, Jeffrey, you should just be friends with me. But you have these whiskey friends, and you say hello again. Oh, Jeffrey, you should just be friends with me. But you have these whiskey friends, and you